Good morning. This webinar offers closed captioning. To enable closed captioning, click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred method. Welcome to the City of Chicago Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection webinars. We have adapted our regular business education workshops at City Hall into these webinars until further notice. Please note any website or email that I mentioned will be posted in the chat. For those seeking business license assistance, we strongly encourage the process of license and permits online. Business license can be applied for or renewed online at chicagobusinessdirect.org, or you can call 312-74-GO-BIZ. If you are a part of the BACP Entrepreneur Certificate Program, you can get credit for joining this webinar by sending an email to bacpoutreach@cityofchicago.org. To learn more about this program, please visit chicago.gov/business education. This webinar is being recorded and will be available at youtube.com/Chicago BACP. We encourage all attendees to ask questions. Please use the chat box to send your questions. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. Please note the views and information and opinions expressed during this webinar are solely those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of the Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection or the City of Chicago. Today's webinar is entitled Disability Awareness Training. At this time, I will now turn this webinar over to Jared for us to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Gerard Lockhart, and I am a training officer with the Mayor's Office for People with Disability. As a visual description, I am an African-American male with glasses, bald head, and a headset and headphones with a microphone, and I'm wearing my City of Chicago jacket. And it is with great pleasure on behalf of Mayor Lightfoot, Commissioner Arfa, and the team at BACP, Rupal's team, for partnering with us to provide disability awareness training to help promote and make the city of Chicago a world-class disability friendly city. So one thing I want to mention for this training, it's a lot of information, and I will provide, or BACP will provide, the slide deck, which is accessible, so you can follow along, or if you need to reference it. And I will, at the end, provide my email address if you have further questions that we can't get into within the, we can't address within an hour. But the training is intended as a starting point for disability education rather than a comprehensive guide. And so, disability awareness, just let me give you a little background on my experience. I've been with MOPD for at least 24 years. In May, it'll be 24 years. And so I've conducted one form of disability awareness and training, in another for over like 20,000 City of Chicago employees and organizations from the public and private sector, employees within them. Uh, we've trained people from the recruits at the police department, the cadets at the fire department, the CTA, Chicago Public Libraries, anyone that interacts with the general public, Chicago Park District, with any member of the public, regardless if they have a disability or not. So just let me know if a question appears in the chat, and you can come off the chat if you like, and I'll be able to address the question. So let's go to the next slide. So, okay, wait. There it is. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to talk about. I just gave an introduction. I give a little information about what we do at MOPD, the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. We'll discuss the prevalence of disabilities, some statistics. We'll do a brief overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about awareness and etiquette, first person language, terminology, and then we'll break down each of the major categories of disabilities for people who will have blind or low vision, people, we'll talk about service animals, the deaf and hard of hearing, people with mobility disabilities, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Then we'll talk about an initiative that we have at the City of Chicago, Chicago Access Officers, which would can be as an accessibility role within your company or organization, and which is not on the outline. As a surprise, we'll add a quiz. So let's go to the next slide. So Chicago's goal is to make MOPD's goal is to make Chicago a world-class disability-friendly city, and we're going to foster that with accessibility, full participation, and equal opportunities for people with disabilities. And our mission is to do this with systemic change, information and referral, education and training, which I'm a part of, public policy, and direct services. For example, the direct services would be people that we serve age 59 and under with with a disability. We only have a small minority of programs that serve people over the age of 59 because that is served by the Family Support Services Department. We do have an amplified phone program and we expanded our home modification program. But our office, we have an architectural services compliance unit that work with builders, we work with developers to make sure that our buildings, new construction or renovations, follow a accessibility permitting process with the building department. We also provide direct services such as Meals on Wheels, uh, personal assistant services. You may formerly know it as like homemaker services. We provide up to 2 to 4, maybe 6 hours a week, depending on how the funding structure is. We also have the ability to provide assistive devices and technology, and a lot of information and referral programs that we do as far as outreach that our office provides. So, disability statistics. So, as far as there are 800,000 people or residents with disabilities in the greater Chicagoland area. I just want you to know I don't read the slides verbatim. That's why we give it to you in advance or afterwards so you can reference it on your own. But the Chicagoland area includes the 7 counties, so it's up to 800,000 people with disabilities, and there's 67% or two-thirds of people with disabilities are persons of color. And then there are over 57,000 number of students with disabilities enrolled in Chicago public schools. Over 22,000 are transition age, meaning 16 to 22, where they can work. And then for organizations, there's over close to a $500 billion amount of the estimated purchasing power for people with disabilities. So when we talk about the prevalence of people with disabilities, there are 26% of adults in the United States report living with at least one disability. And if you think about that, that in the city of Chicago, there are like 60 million visitors annually with disabilities. And due to the disability community count being undercounted, we think that number is greater. And it far exceeds the 300,000 people recorded in the US Census. We have a source at the bottom that has that census data, but they're like over 301,000 people in Chicagoland, 1.4 million across the state of Illinois, and 41 million across the United States. So that number is increasing with the number of the advances in medicine and technology, and the number is underreported because of stigma, and a lot of people wouldn't want to self-disclose what their disability is. But on the next slide, you'll see that over 40% of adults over the age of 65 have a disability. So disability is the fastest growing minority group in the United States. And anyone can become a member of the disability community overnight. The intersectionality of disability proves that it doesn't discriminate based on ethnicity, gender, political affiliation, age, etc. So what we want to do is improve on the attitudinal barriers that people with disabilities face, because you can become disabled at any point in a life cycle, and that doesn't mean that anything is wrong with you or you don't need to be fixed. We moved away from the medical model to the more social, cultural model of disability, where society needs to change. We can help with our architectural accessibility compliance unit with removing architectural barriers, but the hardest substance or barrier that people with disabilities face would be attitudinal barriers or more ableist barriers. So let's talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the Americans with Disabilities Act was one of the first specific civil rights legislation dedicated for people with disabilities. And there were other laws before that, like the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, but the ADA, written by George Herbert Walker Bush, was specifically for people with disabilities, and it gives people with disabilities protective status. Let me go to the next slide. So, also, let me give you a definition of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of life major activities. A person who has a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived as others as having such an impairment. So the first part of that definition may be relatively obvious as far as having a physical or mental impairment. I won't go into too many details, but if you think about the five senses, or the ability to have self-care, or the ability to control digestion or breathing or your cell count, that would be like a permanent physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of life major activities. Or think of it this way, an activity of daily living. Okay. So the second part of the definition may not may be a little ambiguous as far as having a history or record of that impairment. Or the third part, or is being perceived by others as having that impairment. So, a history or record of an impairment could be an example of an individual. Let's say they received a cancer diagnosis or HIV diagnosis, and through medication, uh, there's a question in the chat. Yes, slides will be shared. Definitely, the slides will be shared. Uh, so, a record of that impairment means if you've had in your medical records, you've received a diagnosis, but you may, because of the medicine and the technology, you've recovered and you don't have that diagnosis anymore, you're still covered by the ADA. So you still have protection from the ADA. So that's what that history of that, a record or history of that impairment. Now, the last part is when you're covered where a protected entity is prohibited from discrimination because of an actual or perceived impairment. So, like, some examples would be if someone has a burn or deformity or scar, and someone is prevented from participating in a summer camp because someone perceives that someone has a disability, or it could be because of some subjective rumor or unfounded truth or misinformation about a person, like someone's roommate could have HIV and they think that they have HIV, or even you can even go to even COVID. Well, you're still protected. You may not have a disability, but if someone makes the assumption that you have the disability, then you're still protected by the ADA, and we provided a source that can expand more on that. So, what is considered a major life activity? So, I'll read some of the items on the list, such as breathing, walking, talking, communication, hearing, seeing. I'm gonna jump over to the next column. Standing, moving, reading, caring for yourself, endocrinological functions, immune functions, respiratory functions. So if you think about major life activities, there are over 200 of different types of disabilities. If some of the types that I have listed here, like cerebral palsy, autism, um, someone that is deaf, blind, someone has paralysis or speech impairment, they're readily identifiable. But there's a compassionate allowance listing for disability benefits under the Social Security Administration that has 200 plus disabilities. So just understand that the majority of the disabilities are non-apparent or invisible. Okay, the next slide talks about the ADA when it was signed into law of 1990 and how it gives broad rights, civil rights protection for people with disabilities, which is patterned after the Civil Rights Act of 1965. There were like when there was segregation, there were separate schools for people with disabilities, separate places for voting for people with disabilities. So now it's time to the ADA made society more mainstream where people can be integrated in society together. So let's talk about the five titles. I'm going to concentrate more on Title III, but there are five titles under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I deals with employment and prohibits discrimination in employment settings, in employment applications, and that's usually handled by the professionals from your human resources department or personnel department. Title II deals with state and local government programs and services. And what we do with the city of Chicago, where we train different departments, we train the park district, anyone that serves the public in a local government entity, they have to abide by Title II of the ADA. So it ensures that state and local government entities and special services and districts. Title III, public accommodation, that deals with businesses, that deals with your population. You'll be stakeholders who have to abide by Title III because it prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in places of public accommodations and commercial facilities. And they are also defined as publicly owned businesses that affect commerce. Yes, it does. And we'll talk a little bit about the, the the accessibility guidelines. Someone asked about inaccessible websites, and there's certain type of accessibility criteria that's covered by the web accessibility guidelines. But let me go back to Title IV deals with telecommunications, and the provision of telecommunication deals for services for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. That's why you see in a lot of public places and on national broadcast television networks the ability to have closed captioning. And sometimes for universal access, you'll see them in health clubs and airports where you have captioning in like gyms where they would have the words in that describes the audio or that has voiceovers for the audio that's being described on television programs. Title IV deals with retaliation and other provisions, including those that deals with enforcement of the law and remedies that prove the discrimination. So let's go back to Title III, uh, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in places of public accommodations and commercial facilities. And there, like public accommodations are defined as privately owned businesses that affect commerce and fit into 12 broadly defined categories like eating and drinking establishments, restaurants. Uh, so if you look at the different places of lodging, places of food and drinking establishments, places of entertainment, expositions, like events. We have a strong presence with the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events to make sure that they're accessible. Sales and rental establishments, service establishments, public transportation terminals, depots and stations, places of public display and collection, places of recreation, education, social service center establishments, and places of lodging. Okay, so that pretty much covers all places of public accommodation. And here's more information from the website that talks about the 12 different categories, regardless of the size of the business or age of the building. If you provide services in that building, then it should be accessible. And there's a rule that I always like to recommend people to follow. If you can't bring the individual to the service, then you have to bring the service to the individual. So there are a lot of instances where buildings may be covered by grandfathered as a historical landmark, but if you provide a public service in that building, then it has to be accessible to the public. Okay, next, let's talk about more public accommodations. It requires businesses to remove architectural barriers in existing buildings and make sure that newly built or altered facilities are constructed to be accessible to individuals with disabilities. Grandfather provisions, I just talked about that, often found in local building codes, do not exempt businesses from their obligation under the ADA. And we have an accessibility compliance unit that's expanding. We have building inspectors. I think we're hiring building inspectors. We'll hire more building inspectors that will work with the building department, and we work with builders and architects as far as providing accessibility permitting process. And for the questions, specific questions about the ADA, please refer back to the links that I provided in the sources so you can get more information from the entire ADA document. And actually, someone had a question in the chat. When I get a chance, I'll give you the link so you can look at the ADA as far as for a more expansive definition for that. Let me see if I can add that to the chat right now. All right. Okay, let's talk about the ADA requires businesses to make reasonable modifications or minor adjustments in policies to their usual ways of doing business when serving people with disabilities. For example, allowing extra snacks for individuals with diabetes, extra time for activities and events. That could be like the Ticketmaster or certain events where you have to register for events and it has a countdown. Individuals that may have slower information processing speeds may need that timer to be increased to 30 minutes instead of like the 15 minutes. Reading product labels and instructions. People with dyslexia or people with low vision or people with intellectual disabilities may need assistance with reading instructions. Retrieving merchandise from high shelves that can provide customer service or assistance for providing information and menus. A lot of times they have menus which have QR codes which are not accessible for people with low vision or visual impairments or people who are blind. So that means you can provide an adjustment or a public accommodation. Barrier removal would be parking, accessible entrances, accessible routes to goods and services, shelves, and sales and service counters have to be clear of debris, and they have to be wide enough for wheelchairs to be able to access a path of travel. I'm sorry. Uh, Train your staff. I provided a link to if you need to have your staff trained on disability awareness, and you can receive tax credits and deductions if you for serving people with disabilities. So that is one of the things we recommend that you can do. And people with disabilities continue to face architectural barriers that limit or make it impossible to access the goods and services offered by businesses. And at the end of this training, I'm going to provide some testimonials and ways you can make your business more accessible. So let's talk a little bit about awareness and etiquette. First of all, let's talk about best practices as far as first person language and what language you should use. A person with a disability or a person who is blind. That's called people first or first person language, not disabled person, not a blind person. You want to avoid ableist words and phrases that puts the disability in front of the person because they are a person before they ever develop a disability. So just understand to use people first language. But this also can vary in the disability community where you have identity first language. For example, people use their identity they choose to use their identity like an autistic person rather than a person with autism. Regardless of the term used, ask the person how they want to be identified. That would be the best thing to do. And also, if you don't know, just ask them for their name or sir or ma'am, because a person's name is the only word that can be understood when spoken in everybody's language. You won't get upset if you don't call someone outside of their name. So I would just use a person's name or ask them. Words to retire: handicap, cripple. Now, handicap is a no-no. I wish I had my cap in hand, but the origins of the word handicap go back to World War One, where veterans would stand on street corners with a hat in hand and beg for a handout with a hat in hand. And for some reason, in modern day times, that was used to refer to someone's mental or physical condition. But that has nothing to do with someone's mental or physical condition. But when you refer to a person with a disability as being handicapped, you're saying what? They're the debits of society, always looking for a handout. And then you set up a superior inferior relationship in the arena of sports, sport betting, like bowling, golfing. It sets up a superior inferior relationship, and the person needs a handicap. So eliminate that. The circle with the wheelchair stands for the universal accessibility symbol. It shouldn't say handicap or cripple or special needs. We all have special needs. And if someone calls you special, that they're calling you outside of their name. And even these inspirational words like differently able, uh, that's a word outside of the person's name. So we suggest you retire that. So instead of using handicap, use accessible parking, accessible restroom, accessible entrance. Instead of special needs, going back to we all have special needs, just use disability or a person with a disability instead of differently able. And I know we like to use in vogue terms that go in and out of style every couple of years, but you may offend somebody if you call them outside their name. So more words to retire. I won't go into all of it, but wheelchair bound. No one is bound to a wheelchair. People who use wheelchairs can walk. They can transfer in and out of their wheelchairs. They may use a wheelchair just on an as needed basis. And so they just use it as a piece of equipment like a person would use shoes. Now, especially with the developmental disability community, please eliminate the R word, retarded, mentally challenged. They're very outdated and offensive. Instead, use intellectual, developmental disability, the neurodiverse community, also hearing impaired. So that sets up a negative connotation as something as impaired or wrong with the individual. That goes back to that medical model. So that's why we just say deaf or hard of hearing. Avoid deaf, blind, dumb, deaf, mute. Avoid those words. And also CNI dog. We'll talk about that as far as service animals. So let's talk about tips for communication. Communicate directly with the person with a disability, not their friends, family, or companion. This goes for if you're communicating with somebody that's a like a personal assistant, maybe a companion or adult, somebody that's a American Sign Language interpreter, even in any other language. Speak directly with the person, and it can be challenging, especially if you're speaking with someone that's voicing for someone else. Is look at the person directly that you're communicating with, and speak to them according to their chronological age, and give them the same respect and that you would give anyone else. And also, don't assume that the individual needs your help. Because what's the father, when you assume, that's like being the father of discrimination. You shouldn't make assumptions about people because when you assume, it can lead to discrimination. And if you met one person with a disability, you've only met one person with a disability. You can have three people with the same disability, but they can all have individual and unique needs. So you have to be receptive to the individual's communication and navigation needs. Everybody is different and treat them as an individual. Avoid inspirational porn. That means, wow, you're so amazing for traveling by yourself. People with disabilities want to be viewed the same way as everybody else. So if someone's doing everyday activities, there's no need to glamorize it. And I know it may be pulling on your heartstrings, you get inspired and motivated, but this person is living their life like everybody else. It's all about equal treatment. So avoid using terms as people with disabilities overcome their disability. The correct term is have a disability or live with a disability. They're not overcoming with their disability. They're not trying to be cured. They're just living their life and are fully productive as anyone else with or without a disability. So that goes back to avoiding ableist terms, even though you could be well meaning, but treat people with disabilities the same way you would treat everybody else. I have some more communication tips. Give individuals your full attention. Take the time to listen carefully and give extra time to respond and confirm that you understand. So, anyone that has an auditory or communication disability, maybe a speech impairment caused by stuttering or cerebral palsy, anything, practice patience. Don't answer for someone and interrupt them. Just be patient, listen carefully, and confirm that you understand. Either you have to ask a question that requires a yes or a no, maybe you have to pass notes, and pay attention to nonverbal cues. It can include pointing, gestures, nod, eye gaze, or eye blink. And also, people with speech impairments or people who are deaf and hard of hearing, yelling at them will not help at all. Speak in your natural tone, the same way you speak to everybody else. So, people, let's talk about people who are blind or have low vision. There are individuals who are blind and low vision have varying levels of vision. Not all individuals use service animals or cane, and you may not even know that they have a disability unless they self identify. But when you communicate with people who are blind or have low vision, it's good to identify yourself by introducing yourself. They have a right to know whom they're speaking with. They have a right to know who they are, who you are. So identify yourself, especially if you're working at a front desk or at a restaurant or a building. Identify yourself by name. And if you need to offer what we call wayfinding assistance, or if you need to escort someone from point A to point B, ask the person if they need assistance. Everybody's different, and ask them how they like to be assisted. Everybody's different. Some individuals would like for you to grab their elbow. Some people will want you to walk in front of them. Some people don't want you to touch them at all. Okay, so remember, everybody's different. And if you need to provide directional assistance, then use clock cues. When I say use clock cues, I would suggest not using um, like left or right. Use 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. So that's what I mean by using clock cues. And I'm going to provide a video um, further where you can. It shows you how to provide guiding techniques for guiding somebody that's blind or visually impaired. If they have a white cane versus identification cane, how you would interact with service animals, how you would trail someone if you're escorting someone that's blind or visually impaired, how you should communicate with that person, and ask permission before you touch them. Because if you touch somebody without their permission, that's considered battery. So you want to protect yourself and respect their rights. How to seat somebody in a wheelchair. So we all have guidelines for providing wayfinding assistance, and be aware of protruding objects. Normally, that would be anything that's above 24 inches, 27 inches above the floor or 80 inches below, protruding from a wall, like a television stand, like a wall mounted television, a payphone, a fire alarm, distinguisher of water fountains, anyone that a cane would not be able to detect. You should be aware of that if you're escorting somebody around because a cane would not detect it. So, continuing the blind and low vision community, always be prepared to have materials in alternative formats, including large print, which is 18 or 24 point the size. If it's an electronic format in a smooth, easy to read text, it's called sans serif. I like to use Arial, which is best practice. If it's an electronic format, make sure it's compatible with a screen reader, and avoid using PDF documents unless you know how to tag them to be accessible. As far as you can format headings, and you have to know how to format a body of the text. You have to provide audio descriptions and alternative text for images. Unless you know how to do that, then be prepared to provide audio descriptions. For actual audio descriptions, for like a visual description of an event, last summer during the Air and Water Show's test run, it was a practice. For the first time, we provided audio descriptions of the Air and Water Show. So that was a first. But like at movie theaters, I know AMC has that. You can provide an assisted listening device where you can get an audio description of a movie where there's a person describing each scene, like two actors shaking hands during a play. I think Netflix and other streaming services have that option where if the movie has audio descriptions. During virtual meetings, as I did at the beginning, you could provide an for especially during the first time of the meeting, either in person or online, you should provide an audio description of the speaker. Describe yourself. For example, I described myself as African American male wearing glasses, in my MOPD shirt, salt and pepper beard with a headset. Also, you should describe what's in the chat because on Zoom, the chat is not accessible. And if you're doing a production, you may have had to have people running the chat behind you so you can describe items in the chat. For example, there's a lot of things going on in the chat now. We're going to talk about physical challenges, and we do provide training and more training with the police department, and we're working on that now. Some people had questions regarding people with physical disabilities and the police department, which we are working on. We have an ADA coordinator at the police department, actually two people serving that. So we will take that feedback definitely to them. So yeah, visual description, have digital copies available in which where you would have them, and also data on charts. We're actually working with different departments to provide images, provide description of images. Okay, either alt text descriptions or provide like simple text of images in social media and on websites where we're offering that training. So let's talk about service animals. Service animals are any animals that, or a horse, like a dog or a horse that's been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. And it's not just for people who are blind, it's people who are have seizures, people with epilepsy, people who need help with balance, just people who are deaf to need to be alerted to sounds, people who need to be reminded to take medication. But if you're working at the front desk and you have a no pets policy, there are only two questions you can ask for a person with a disability, and this is by the U.S. Department of Justice. The first question is the dog or service animal required because of a disability? And the second question is, what work or task has a dog been trained to perform? That's all you can ask. Okay. One thing, the animals can be individually trained, so they don't have to have any badge or requirement. They don't have to have a harness. So you can't ask for any ID. And it's personal health information. So you can't go any further than those two questions about the service animal required because of a disability, which is a yes or no question, and also what work or the task has been trained to perform. Now, I understand this may come up if people abuse the system with emotional support animals, which don't have the same rights as a service animal. Then look at the behavior of the animal, because a service animal, it's almost like a piece of equipment. You don't even know that they're there. They're very silent. They don't move. They get stepped on. You just don't even know that they're there. So just look at the behavior of the animal. Don't pet the animal, don't feed the animal without the owner's permission, because the animal's there to serve as a guide and to avoid obstacles in the person's path. You don't want to distract the animal. Okay. And there's different rules under the FAA with flying, but we're talking about in the city of Chicago for service animals. Okay, so the two questions as far as identifying the type of service animal, you just ask yes or no, and the individual. So there's a question about identifying the type of service animal, essentially identifies a person's disability, and it should be protected private information. Well, the user can probably answer that question without going too far into that actual information. But yeah, we can address that also as far as not revealing too much information. And I understand that comment. So this is a YouTube video that I talked about. Let me provide that in the chat as far as uh, it's actually in the document that I provided as far as how to escort a blind and visually impaired individual. I don't want to hit play now because it's 9 minutes and we only have like 15 minutes left. And so, but it talks about different techniques on how to guide individuals who are blind or visually impaired. It's called wayfinding assistance, instructional techniques. So let's talk about the deaf and hard of hearing community. Technology is very important. And a general rule to use for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people with any auditory 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 disabilities. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue tied. Um, so avoid the use of hearing impaired. That assumes the person is impaired, and uses the term that the person uses to identify themselves, either deaf, hard of hearing loss, or late deafened. Some people use hearing aids, cochlear implants, or others use no assistive technology. Remember earlier I said everybody's different. And louder environments make it hard to hear. And some individuals are good readers and some can speak for themselves, others cannot. Everybody's different. Some use sign language. Some people are not good lip readers. Like estimates reveal that only 30% of words can be understood with reading lips. I tried this yesterday. I tried this on Monday this week. If you could read my lips, you would be a genius. Maybe you could put the answer in the chat. See if you could read my lips. I say it one more time. Now, if you can read my lips, then you're a great lip reader. But if you're working, I would just say pass notes to be 100%, or ask yes or no questions, or provide assistive technology such as uh, closed captioning, or a CART service, which is a human transcriptionist, which would be more accurate. Okay, Terry, Olivia, you're correct. I said olive oil. I asked this Monday because I think Monday was Valentine's Day. Other people would say I love you, but it was olive oil. You got it right, Olivia. X. Okay, so speaking your natural tone when you communicate with the deaf and hard of hearing, because when we communicate with the deaf or hard of hearing, the first thing we do is we lick our lips, and then we speak slow. We say, "Welcome. How can I help you?" And we say it louder. And that's, we're trying to be helpful, but you're treating people differently. I always said, treat people with disabilities the same way you treat everybody else. Don't speak slow. Don't over exaggerate your speech. Don't speak loud. You have to be in a well lit room. The light source has to be on you a certain way. If you have a lot of facial hair, that can be hard to understand. But also, just practice patience. Practice patience and make sure that you understand what the person's saying. No bluffing. Don't pretend that you know. So there are different types of accessibility for the deaf or hard of hearing community, which I talked about: real-time captioning, American Sign Language. You can use on-site interpreters, remote interpreters. Remember that etiquette as far as communicating directly with the person you want to. With interpreters, any background noise, sounds, profanity, they're going to communicate that verbatim. So make sure that you're communicating everything you say is going to be communicated with the interpreter. And then for events and accessibility, there can be seating sections up front so people can actually view the interpreter. So accessibility benefits everyone. Universal access benefits everyone. So understand accessibility, the accessible routes of your facility, and make sure that they're in working condition. Know that there's been several times where people have been told that their establishment is accessible and there's stairs leading to the restroom. So the accessible routes have to be places to the restroom, to escape routes, emergency routes, places of refuge, and they have to be in working order. Pace parent transit or pick up and drop off areas have to be allowed to be open, like ramps. Some events they have steel barricades that can block the curb cuts and ramps. That have to be available. You have to know how to get accessibility providers, how to procure sign language interpreters. We can provide with companies we use. We don't endorse. We can provide you that information as far as what if you need braille. In things like large print, as long as you have a printer and you can make things double space, that can be accessible because a lot of flyers on shiny brochures have glares on it that could make it inaccessible. So large print on black and white paper is an easy, almost free, inexpensive solution. And also clear masks for your staff. Clear masks for people who can read lips, but because of COVID, you want to be safe. That's an option also. Also, other options, you can have events with low sensitivity events with low sensory overload. Uh, you know, People that have different information processing needs. You can have different alternative events like quiet areas, things like that. Okay, let's talk about mobility disabilities. We talked about this earlier. Don't use the term wheelchair bound. No one is bound to a wheelchair. Don't touch anyone or their wheelchair without their permission. That's an extension of the person. Get permission. And if you communicate with people with low vision for an extended period of time, find a chair so you can be at eye level so they won't have to strain to look up at you. And also be aware of the physical spaces and make sure that they're in working order, from lifts and ramps or automatic doors, or if they're not working, then make sure that someone is there that can operate them. But we prefer that the devices be independently operated because we want to enhance everyone's independence. So that's why I make sure that those are in working order. When you communicate with people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, speak directly to the person. Don't make assumptions. Don't assume about a person's intelligence level. Speak to them according to their chronological age. Communicate in plain language. And also take time to explain things in a sequential order. I know I speak fast and I have to work on giving step by step guides as far as how things handle in an order. Like if you're at an airport, you're going to take your ticket, you're going to go to baggage check in, then you're going to go to the security check in. So you have to give things in step by step order. Um, and you may need to give one-on-one assistance. Use patience. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Gio, for the kind words in the chat. Next is a pop quiz. Who do you contact from your organization if you have an accessibility related question or request? Well, for the city of Chicago, last summer we developed access officers, which every department has a deputy level, which is like the second highest level of the department, of a person that's responsible to ensuring all the accessibility needs are taken care of within each department. So they've gone through this training, several trainings, like 7 different types of trainings similar to this, to provide that role. So we suggested you have that within your organization, within your company. Someone who can take the handle the accessibility request. Someone that's had our disability awareness training or any type of disability awareness training. Okay, that knows how to get an interpreter, how to provide large print, how to treat people with disabilities like people. So establish that role, train your staff, you know, how to provide like a contact list. Maybe it's the customer service person. For the city of Chicago, we have an access email address after all emails for each department because they know how to contact somebody if they have an accessibility request for that specific department. So you had to have a point of contact on site that has an email address and telephone number. Yeah, and you can't put all the onus on one person because they'll designate that to other people below them. So we, outside of our access officer roles, they have like a team of people because you always need a backup, and you should train the entire staff because accessibility benefits everyone. Okay, so this slide talked about public facing programs. When we deal with our Title II programming, if you have an event that's open to the public where you have visitors, you have vendors, a vendor could be a member of the public, a client. If someone's applying for a job, then that means you need to be accessible for them. You don't want to have any eligibility requirements that would screen out people with disabilities. For instance, if you have a job that doesn't require driving, then why do you need a driver's license? Just change it to like ID, or if you don't require a job that requires standing for a long period of time in a stool will be fine, and they can still perform the essential duties of the job, then maybe you could take that off of the job requirements. We don't want you to screen out people with disabilities. We want to increase the employment of people with disabilities at the working age, which is less than half of people without disabilities. So think about this when it comes to interviews, information sessions, tests, online tests, walk-in encounters, meetings, schedule appointments, video appointments, and podcasts and exhibits. Some like public engagement, intake forms, the application, registration process. And this also includes online informational sessions, administration tests, anything that deals with the public. And all of the links that I provide in the chat, which probably aren't accessible, will be provided in the email that will come after this training. So let's see if someone wants to answer this question. What is the most appropriate term used to refer to a person with a disability? You could put it in the chat. A is special, B is handicapped, C is handy capable, D is that person's name. Wow, you answered that fast, Cynthia. D, 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 Sam, D, S said D. Okay, that's the correct answer. D, the person's name. Good. Let's see if I have another one in the last minutes that I wrote. Okay, here's a pop quiz. And this, I don't know if you want to come off mute to answer this question, but I'm going to read this. It's kind of long. So, Scott visited a local Chicago restaurant for service animal Sam. After he sits down, the restaurant owner approaches Scott and tells him that the restaurant has a no pet policy. Scott states that the animal is a service animal. The restaurant owner asks Scott to show paperwork for the dog. Scott does not have the paperwork, so is asked to leave. Later that day, Scott calls the city to report this issue. He would call the Chicago Commission on Human Relations to file a disability complaint. Or he would call us, stating that the restaurant owner is out of compliance, which is business license, with his business license. Did Scott violate the no pet policy? If so, how would you handle this complaint? So let me try to paraphrase this. I get obviously the business owner didn't come to our training this morning, and an individual has a service animal, but the owner approaches Scott and tells him, he has to leave because there's a no pet policy, and they have signs on the door, right? No shoes, no shirts, no pets, no services. And so Scott doesn't bring paperwork with him. I mean, who wants to carry their paperwork? So yeah, so Scott, yeah, so yeah, the owner, you guys have the correct answer to educate Scott on how to be compliant and provide the rules and regulations in writing. And he was violated. The customer should have allowed to eat at his restaurant, and the owner should be given a citation from the city. Educate, educate. Okay. Well, I would say that education would be the best policy because you only can ask two questions, and I've had comments about the second question, but the owner does have is responsible, has to be in control of the animal, and an animal cannot threaten or disrupt the other customers. But you can't ask the owner to leave. Maybe the animal can leave if it's being disruptive and threatening people, and it can't be a subjective fear. It has to be a direct threat. But the owner has the same rights to visit the restaurant as everyone else does, and the owner of the restaurant cannot ask the owner of that service animal to leave or ask for ID. So here's some testimonials. And it's anonymous, but one is, I had to paraphrase it. One is, ideally, information about accessibility should be available for everyone. We always have a tagline asking for accessibility needs, but you don't have to single out people with disability. So if you give a visual description, you don't have to say, I'm doing this for people who are blind or visually impaired. You can say, this is for people who are on the phone, who are listening. And at the beginning of every single business affairs, webinar, you could just provide the accessibility needs because everyone can use it. It's not just for people with disabilities. Another person we asked, and I took the quotations off because of the QR codes was needed, and the subsequent form needed to be completed, and as a result, the items needed to be read verbally. This was a positive testimonial because to enter, and this wasn't even based on a menu at a restaurant. I'm aware of menus that have QR codes. This was at a facility to get a COVID test, and there was a QR code, and there was a questionnaire about the like 4 questions. Did you have COVID symptoms? But the QR code isn't accessible, so you have to provide an alternative format like a paper. And also pointing instead of giving verbal instructions. It happens to me a lot in home appliance stores or hardware stores. But if someone asks you something obvious, it's probably because they can't read or can't see it, not just because they're blind or have a low vision. They could be dyslexic or they just speak a different language. So you may need to give verbal directions to give the clock cues. So here's the Q&A. If you have any questions about everything that we talked about and I went over, I'm sorry that I went over. But also, please enjoy the weekend, everyone. In the chat, there are links, not in the chat, in the PowerPoint that we'll provide for if you want to have your staff participate in disability awareness training, you can sign up. And please sign up for our newsletter. So you could be prepared we have a newsletter every month for MOPD. We're highlighting Black Chicagoans with disabilities for Black History Month, this newsletter. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let me know. We'll send the information to you or email me. I don't know if you need to take a picture of the email, but you will get the slides with my email if you want to sign up for disability awareness training. So I'm out of time now. I don't know if I'm here. I'll be online if you have any questions until the meeting is over.
Um, this is Stella from BACP. It looks like you may have some questions. I'm just going through the chat.
Yeah. I tried to address those without specifically addressing it.
Hmm.
I think I addressed everyone
Yeah.
that I could. Let me see. Yeah, there's some real good points about designating one person to have that responsibility. Everybody from your office should have that type of knowledge about accessibility. Oh, the slide, they want me to put back the previous slide on the screen. And everybody on here will have the PowerPoint that has all the links work. And if you need to contact, oh wait, no, that's not the right slide. I think this is a slide two on it. Okay. All right. So thank you. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Okay, that's the one. Okay. So I'll be here until I'm dismissed. If you have any questions. Thank you. Have a blessed day too. So in the chat it says a copy of the webinar will be posted to youtube.com, Chicago BACP.
It looks like you answered everyone's questions. They don't really have any, which is a good thing. That means it was a really clear presentation.
I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. So just I'll be on until you tell me to get off, and if anyone
I'm
has
just
any questions.
just going through it. I don't see anything in the Q&A. Yeah, no one has any question. So we can just go ahead and end it. To find out more about our upcoming webinars, please visit chicago.gov/business education. Again, that's chicago.gov/business education. Everyone have a great weekend. And thank you again, Mr. Lockhart, for your presentation. Hope to see
Uh,
you again soon.
all right. Take care. Bye bye.